On a freezing Christmas Eve, a powerful elderly billionaire sat alone in a crowded restaurant, surrounded by laughter, yet completely invisible. Her untouched meal grew cold as families celebrated all around her. Then the door opened. A black single father stepped inside with his young daughter, eyes lowered, already used to being judged before they spoke a word. What happened next lasted only seconds, but it exposed a quiet form of racism, privilege, and loneliness that America rarely talks about. One small act changed everything. But why did it unsettle an entire room? And what truth did it force them all to face? Comment and tell us where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories reach. And subscribe for more powerful stories that deserve to be heard. Christmas Eve usually meant warmth, noise, and belonging for most people in the city. For Catherine Morrison, it meant silence. At 72, she had everything money could buy: power, influence, a name that opened doors, but none of it followed her into the quiet spaces of her life. Since the accident that took her husband and confined her to a wheelchair, the days blurred together. Business meetings filled her calendar, but nights were long, empty reminders of everything she had sacrificed to build an empire. That evening, she chose to dine out not because she was hungry, but because sitting alone in her penthouse felt heavier than facing strangers. The restaurant was alive with celebration. Families leaned close, laughter echoing off polished wood and glass. Catherine noticed every detail: the empty chair across from her, the untouched plate, the way people avoided meeting her eyes. She told herself she didn't care. She had trained herself not to. Across town, Daniel Parker was buttoning a worn coat around his daughter, Emma. Life had taught him efficiency, how to stretch a paycheck, how to turn exhaustion into routine. As a skilled carpenter without formal credentials, he worked harder than most and earned less than many. Rejection letters piled up quietly, always polite, always final. Emma never saw those. What she saw was her father showing up every day, no matter how tired he was. That night, Daniel promised her something simple: dinner out, lights in the windows, a moment that felt like everyone else's holiday. He avoided places where he knew they'd be stared at, judged, or made to feel like they didn't belong. Racism wasn't always loud. It lived in looks, in silence, in opportunities quietly withdrawn. Daniel had learned that lesson well. As they walked through the cold, Emma squeezed his hand, pointing at decorations glowing behind glass. To her, the world still felt open. Daniel wished he could protect that feeling forever. What neither of them knew was that a single wrong turn, one unplanned step into a restaurant meant for someone else, was about to pull their lives into the orbit of a woman who believed she had already lived her story. And standing in the shadows of that world, watching closely, was Richard Chen, a man who believed power belonged only to those who fit his definition of worth. None of them understood it yet, but Christmas Eve was about to expose a truth none of them could walk away from. The moment Daniel pushed open the restaurant door, the warmth inside clashed with the cold he carried on his shoulders. Conversations softened, then stalled. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was unmistakable. Heads turned. Eyes lingered. Daniel felt it instantly, that familiar tightening in his chest. He adjusted Emma's coat, instinctively placing himself between her and the room. He scanned the space, already calculating. Too expensive, too quiet, too many people who looked like they belonged. This wasn't where they were supposed to be. He whispered that they'd leave, that they'd find somewhere else, but Emma had already noticed the lights, the decorations, the glow that made the room feel magical. She tugged his hand, curious, unafraid. Across the room, Catherine watched them without meaning to. She recognized remnants of herself in Daniel's posture, not the struggle, but the vigilance. The way he stood as if prepared to defend himself at any second. She had spent decades in boardrooms filled with people who questioned her worth, her authority, her right to sit at the table. Power had protected her eventually. Daniel didn't have that shield. A few tables away, Richard Chen noticed them too. His eyes narrowed, not with concern but irritation. The restaurant wasn't just a place to eat. It was a space he believed belonged to a certain class, a certain image. He leaned back in his chair, watching Daniel like a problem waiting to surface. Emma, oblivious to all of it, slipped her hand free. Before Daniel could stop her, she walked toward Catherine's table. The room seemed to hold its breath. Daniel felt panic rise. He took a step forward, already preparing to apologize, to explain, to shrink. "Emma," he whispered sharply, but it was too late. She looked up at Catherine with simple honesty and said, "You look lonely." A few people shifted uncomfortably. Someone let out a quiet laugh that wasn't kind. Daniel's face burned. He rushed forward, apologizing under his breath, expecting annoyance, dismissal, something cold. Instead, Catherine smiled. That single moment cracked something open. Catherine hadn't been spoken to like that in years, not honestly, not without fear or expectation. Emma's words weren't polite or rehearsed. They were true, and truth, she realized, made people uncomfortable. Daniel braced himself for what usually came next. A manager stepping in, a complaint, a look that said, "You don't belong here." Racism didn't need slurs. It thrived in silence and assumptions. Richard finally spoke, his voice calm but edged. "Sir, I think your child may be disturbing other guests." Daniel froze. He had heard that tone before, measured, controlled, designed to sound reasonable while asserting dominance. He opened his mouth to respond, careful, controlled, knowing one wrong word could spiral. Catherine spoke first. "She's not disturbing me." The words landed heavier than expected. Heads turned again, this time toward Catherine. Richard's expression tightened. He hadn't expected resistance, especially not from her. Daniel felt caught between gratitude and fear. Attention was dangerous. He wanted to disappear to protect Emma from becoming a spectacle. But Catherine wasn't finished. She invited them to sit. That invitation did more than pull chairs together. It shifted the balance of the room. Some guests watched with curiosity, others with thinly veiled disapproval. Daniel felt every second stretch as they sat, as if the act itself challenged an unspoken rule. Richard watched closely, his jaw clenched. To him, this wasn't kindness, it was disruption. Authority being shared, boundaries being crossed. As dinner unfolded, the tension didn't fade, it evolved. Conversations at nearby tables resumed, but quieter. People listened without meaning to. Daniel spoke little, measuring every word. Catherine listened more than she talked, noticing how often Daniel glanced around, how Emma leaned comfortably toward her without realizing how rare that comfort was. This wasn't just a dinner anymore. It was a collision between power and prejudice, innocence and entitlement, silence and choice. And while the room slowly returned to its rhythm, Richard made a decision of his own. He wasn't done watching. Because what began as a simple act of kindness on Christmas Eve was becoming something far more dangerous to the system he believed in. And the consequences were only just beginning. The turning point didn't arrive loudly. It arrived behind closed doors, under bright lights, in a room where decisions were made that shaped lives without ever touching them. Weeks after Christmas Eve, Daniel stood inside a corporate conference room that felt colder than the street outside. The walls were glass, transparent yet isolating, designed to display power. This was Catherine's world, and now it was his. He had been invited under the promise of opportunity, a chance, a conversation, but the air in the room told a different story. Richard sat at the head of the table, composed, confident, surrounded by people who looked like him, spoke like him, and belonged here in ways Daniel never had. Daniel felt it again, that familiar pressure, the unspoken test. His resume lay open in front of them, dissected not for skill but for absence. No degree, no connections, no polish that fit their version of success. Richard's voice cut through the silence. Calm, surgical, impressive hands-on work, he said before pausing. But this position requires alignment. Alignment, Daniel knew what that word meant. He had heard it in emails, interviews, polite rejections. It meant you don't fit. It meant we don't trust you with power. It meant people like you don't lead here. Daniel glanced at Catherine. She was quiet, her expression unreadable. For the first time since they met, he wondered if this was where it ended. If kindness had limits, if power always chose itself in the end. Richard leaned forward, pressing the moment. "This isn't personal. It's just how things work." That was when Catherine stood. The room stilled. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Authority lived in her presence, earned through decades of battles no one in that room had survived but her. "This is personal," she said evenly. "You just don't feel it because it's never been aimed at you." Richard tried to smile it off. He spoke about risk, about reputation, about standards. Each word tightened the knot in Daniel's chest. Then Catherine did something none of them expected. She named it. She spoke about talent dismissed because it didn't come wrapped in privilege, about doors quietly closed, about how racism didn't always shout, it whispered, smiled, and justified itself as policy. She spoke about Emma, about watching a child walk into a room without fear and realizing how quickly the world teaches black children to lose that innocence. Richard interrupted, sharper now. "This is emotional decision-making." "No," Catherine replied, "this is accountability." The room shifted. Eyes dropped. The truth had weight, and no one wanted to carry it. Daniel stood frozen, unsure if he should speak, unsure if speaking would cost him everything. But then he remembered Emma's hand in his, her belief, her certainty that he belonged. "I've done the work," he said quietly. "Every time I was told no, I kept going. Not because I thought the system was fair, but because my daughter is watching." Silence followed, heavy, unavoidable. Richard looked around, realizing too late that the room was no longer fully his. Power was slipping, not taken by force but exposed by truth. Catherine made the decision. "This ends today," she said, "and it ends now." As Daniel exhaled, heart racing, he understood something in that moment. This wasn't just about a job, it was about who gets seen, who gets trusted, and who finally gets believed, and the fallout from that decision was only just beginning. What happened after that meeting didn't make headlines, but it changed lives. Daniel didn't walk out of that room celebrated. He walked out exhausted. The kind of exhaustion that comes from standing your ground in a world designed to wear you down quietly. But something was different this time. The silence that followed wasn't dismissal, it was consequence. The rules that had protected people like Richard for decades had finally been questioned in a room where they usually went unchallenged. Catherine kept her word. Daniel was given the role not as charity but as responsibility, and with it came scrutiny, every decision watched, every mistake anticipated. But Daniel didn't shrink. He worked harder than anyone expected, not to prove he deserved a seat at the table, but to prove the table itself was too small for the talent it kept excluding. He brought others with him. Young black men like Marcus, who had been overlooked, underestimated, and quietly pushed aside, were given opportunities Daniel never had. Skills were taught. Confidence was rebuilt. Futures shifted. Not overnight, but permanently. Richard didn't disappear, he adapted. Power rarely vanishes, it resists, reshapes, waits, but something about him changed too. The certainty that the system would always protect him was gone. For the first time, accountability had a name, a face, and a record. At home, Emma noticed the difference before anyone else. Her father stood taller, not louder, steadier. The fear she had grown up sensing without understanding slowly loosened its grip. She still didn't know all the words for what he faced. She didn't need to. She only knew that when she looked at him now, she saw pride instead of weight. And Catherine, once isolated by regret and power, found something she hadn't built with money. She found connection, purpose, a reason to keep fighting not just for legacy, but for change. This wasn't a story about a billionaire saving a man. It was a story about a system being forced to see what it had been trained to ignore. Racism doesn't always scream. Sometimes it smiles. Sometimes it calls itself policy. Sometimes it hides behind words like fit and standards and culture. And every day, people like Daniel are told, quietly, politely, that they don't belong. The question isn't whether racism still exists. The question is how often we look away when it does. And when the moment comes, when truth stands in front of us asking to be acknowledged, will we choose comfort or will we choose to act? If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe to Black Community Struggles for more powerful stories about justice, truth, and the fight to be seen. And don't forget to hit the like button. Your support helps these stories reach the people who need them most.